Thank you guys for coming um, to our office hours. As you know, we do them every second and fourth Wednesday of the month at 3 o'clock. So here we are, and we have a wonderful guest speaker today. Um, but first, we're going to introduce our team. Sydney, can you go to there you go. So this is us. We are the Supervision Monitoring and Support Team. I am Jennifer Gleason. Um, And with us today are Carly Thibodeau
Hi,
and Ashley Satry. Go ahead, Carly. Say hi.
hi, everybody.
And we have a wonderful guest speaker. We are so excited because she has a wealth of knowledge about McKinney-Vento. Sydney Lynch is here. So come on, Sydney, introduce yourself and do your thing.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name's Signe Lynch. I am the McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Specialist at the Maine DOE. I serve in the role of state coordinator under the federal statute for homeless education, and I am in the Office of School and Student Supports on the Climate Culture Resilience team. So happy to be here today. And do you want me to go dive right in here? All right. So, I am here to talk about just an overview of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act in general. So talking a little bit about what the rights are of students' eligibility for McKinney-Vento within our school systems, and then some of the resources that are available and how to get in contact with your local liaisons. And really, if there's any questions along the way, please feel free to throw it in the chat or come off mute and ask away, and we can address questions as they come up. And I'm going to try and monitor the chat while I'm here as well. So before I dive in, I was wondering if folks that are here in attendance wouldn't mind throwing into the chat on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being this is the first time I've ever heard of McKinney-Vento before, 5 being I'm an expert, I want to give the presentation here myself. I would love to just know how familiar people are with this federal statute. Awesome. Anna, Carrie, thank you. Yeah, great. Okay, so people have heard of McKinney-Vento before, might be aware of eligibility and all of those pieces. So we're going to dive in a little deeper today and hopefully provide at least a reminder and then hopefully some new information for you as well. But big picture, McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act was the first major federal legislative response to homelessness across the country. It was first passed in 1987, and it's had multiple amendments along the way and reauthorizations. And the most recent in that is the part of Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015 was the most recent reauthorization that had some language changes. And so where this sits is we have that federal statute. So there's a lot of pieces within the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And when we talk about how this education provisions related to the education of homeless children and youth, and within state statute or state rules governing Department of Education, State Board of Education, this is Chapter 14. And that's the education of homeless students, where we've taken all of those federal pieces and adapted it to provide some clarification on what the state dispute resolution process is, for example, and delineating some of that fiscal responsibility between SAUs. So if you're not familiar with Chapter 14, certainly it's not a super lengthy read, but it is very informative in terms of how Maine schools provide supports for students experiencing housing instability. We also have our non-regulatory guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that was released in 2016. That's our most updated non-regulatory guidance. I always like to frame just how this plays out in terms of this federal statute. We have our U.S. Department of Education that just has very few folks up there that provide monitoring to states for McKinney-Vento and then oversee funding distribution. So there is a federal funding line for McKinney-Vento, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But they fund also the National Center for Homeless Education. So often when I'm working with our school folks that are supporting students and families, we reference from the Maine DOE a lot of the guidance and resources that are available through the National Technical Assistance Center, which is NCHE, the National Center for Homeless Education. They also have a hotline that's available to any school or family that was looking for additional information. And then at the DOE level, and my role within the Office of School and Student Supports is providing some of that Maine specific technical assistance. I have a lot of conversations with our schools, a lot of conversations with families and community providers of what McKinney-Vento means, what is eligibility. We also oversee funding, so that includes that McKinney-Vento specific funding that we have a request for applications on. We also have funding through the state from preventing student homelessness. I'll talk a little bit more about these funding pieces, but just giving a framework of how this works from federal to local level. And then our role at the state is really to provide dispute resolution. So what happens at the local level is a lot of the McKinney-Vento implementation. So that's really where eligibility is determined by liaisons. There's those conversations with setting aside funding, general fund dollars, Title I Part A funds. But that's really where there's a local liaison, eligibility is determined, those initial dispute resolution process plays out, and that's all happening at the local level. And the Maine DOE here is here to support with some of the technical assistance pieces, dispute resolution, and then overseeing funding coming through the state legislature and federal funds. So McKinney-Vento, what's the definition of McKinney-Vento? McKinney-Vento protections, they apply to all of our public school students, preschool through grade 12 who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And so really how I like to think about this is, can that student go to the same place every night, and is that place safe and sufficient? If that's that fixed, regular, and adequate definition, and if one of those key elements is missing from a student's nighttime residence, that's where we want to have some follow-up conversations, maybe engage our liaison, have some more conversations with that student or family to discuss possible eligibility for McKinney-Vento. Something I always like to note to educators and community providers is that there's not a federally aligned definition of what homelessness is. And so within that, when we talk about homelessness in education, we use really one of the most flexible definitions of homelessness available. So we look at all the different forms of housing instability that a young person might be experiencing that could present as a barrier to education, and they can be identified for services and protections because of that housing instability. Our definition that we use in education does have some differences between services that they might be eligible through for a housing voucher that might be offered through housing and urban development, or something that DHHS might be using. So just being wary that there are those varying definitions and that this isn't a federally aligned definition. But when we talk about it, this definition in education, we're using a really flexible definition of homelessness. Something I did really want to note here is that this is a very common question that our team receives. A student who is in the custody of DHHS is considered what we would call a foster care student, really regardless of the placement. If they're in the custody of DHHS, even if that student is temporarily placed with a caseworker in a hotel, or an older youth might be placed in a youth shelter for the time being, those students, if they're in the care and custody of DHHS, we would consider them what we would call a foster care student. And this presentation today doesn't really focus on foster care students, but something to note is that foster care students have very similar rights and protections. They just fall under a different foster care provision under federal statute. And one of the key changes that occurred in Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015 was the removal of awaiting foster care placement from the definition of McKinney-Vento. So that was previously students that were identified as McKinney-Vento. Now, if they're awaiting foster care placement, so they're not in, a fixed, regular, and adequate foster care placement at that time, they're still considered foster care because those foster care provisions were built out as part of ESSA. So I just something to note that if you are working with a student that is in the custody of DHHS, they're a foster care student. We have a foster care point of contact here at the Maine DOE. It's Aubrey Howard in the Office of School and Student Supports, but you can always reach out to me as well, and I can get you in contact and get you the right information. But just something to note. One of the pieces about McKinney-Vento federal statute is that it does require every local education agency or SAU, school administrative unit here in Maine, does need to have a McKinney-Vento liaison designated. And that person has a lot of responsibilities under the federal statute to ensure students are considered eligible, receiving services. And something to note is that in most of our SAUs in Maine, the McKinney-Vento liaison is wearing multiple hats, and there's no requirement of, who needs to hold this position. So we do have, superintendents, special education directors, as well as school social workers, family engagement coordinators, wearing the hat of McKinney-Vento liaison within their school community. And something to note is we also have our charter school liaison. So our charter schools are receiving public dollars. They're following these laws as well. So we have liaisons designated there. And there's also a tab. So this is our McKinney-Vento liaison lookup tool is one of our most visited sites on our Maine DOE page. But you can type in the nighttime residence of a student, and it will take you to the contact information for that liaison for that school community. So this is a very convenient and easy tool to use when you're working with students to just figure out who to contact. We see a lot of community providers using this, as well as our liaisons and families as well. I know I was just speaking briefly to foster care. Similar to McKinney-Vento, every school, every SAU has to have a foster care point of contact for communication about services, and we are developing a lookup tool that will be available for those foster care points of contact as well. So when we frame supports that are available for McKinney-Vento, as I had said prior, there's that NCHE, the National TA Center. You have myself at the DOE level. Then we have that federally required SAU liaison for McKinney-Vento, who's really that first point of contact at the local level for when you're working with a student that may be eligible or is eligible. We also have some contacts on the early education side. So Jackie Hersom, if you're familiar from Child Development Services, helps support McKinney-Vento students that are experiencing housing instability on the younger side in our early education programs. We also have Head Start and Early Head Start. Our McKinney-Vento or students that are in a McKinney-Vento eligible nighttime residence are eligible for Head Start and Early Head Start services. So that's something to be aware of too, that those referrals can be made over to Head Start and Early Head Start. And then something I wanted to note too is, and this is Maine specific statute that was passed in recent years, is that our UMaine system schools, our community college systems, and Maine Maritime all have McKinney-Vento liaisons designated. So at the higher education level, we don't have a requirement from federal statute that, these students receive the same McKinney-Vento eligibility and services. But we do want to create opportunities for students that are experiencing housing instability during their secondary school career to be able to have that opportunity to transition to higher education, post-secondary options. And some of that Maine specific statute is that designation of liaisons at that level that can help with navigating financial aid, navigating housing opportunities, particularly thinking about on-campus opportunities for students that may need to be there over school break, for example. So that is a great opportunity that we have, that our liaisons at our SAUs are working with those for those warm handoffs to post-secondary opportunities in Maine. clarifying just who is encompassed in that federal definition of McKinney-Vento eligibility, so we know that it's lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And specifically, that could be students that are living in a campground, they're living outside. It also talks about students that might be living in, for example, a camper in someone's backyard, and that not being a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Any student that's living in a hotel or motel, it's not our students on vacation with their family. They are moving into a hotel or motel because they lack another place to live. Couch surfing, this is a really big piece of McKinney-Vento, and it falls into a larger category called doubled up, which is really just that sharing housing due to a loss of housing because of economic hardship or a similar reason. So this could be families that may have received an eviction and they're not able to find their own housing again, and they move in with another family member, or they move in with a friend for the time being while they look for their own housing. Any student that's living in a shelter or a transitional living program, I also like to mention we have some for our older students. There are programs across the state that are run by agencies, for example, Preble Street in southern Maine, New Beginnings in central Maine, Shaw House in northern Maine, that offer transitional living programs for older youth that might be experiencing homelessness. Those programs can go on from a year, 18 months, 2 years, the entire time of students in a transitional living program. They would be eligible for McKinney-Vento. Students living in cars. This is actually a photo. Does anyone know where this photo is from, actually? I should ask. So it's from Washington County. It's from Wyman's Blueberry Fields. And really, this is a reference to students that are eligible for Migrant Education Program services, another federal program. And really what that means is just students that have traveled with their families or themselves for seasonal agricultural or fishery work in the past 3 years. So often it's not an automatic eligibility if they were eligible for Migrant Education Program, but it is something that we see often a dual eligibility for, just because if students are moving for these work opportunities, there's instability in housing, and the housing that is offered by employers for these seasonal work opportunities is often not going to meet our adequate definition for McKinney-Vento. And that leads to a section of McKinney-Vento's definition that's substandard housing. So substandard housing could be families that might lack a vital utility, families that may have pests or vermin in the home that could make the children safe. We sometimes see mold or something like that, but vital utilities is often what we see substandard identification picked up on, considering especially in the springtime, we see a lot of families that aren't able to keep their power on in the springtime because they might have accrued a really significant bill over the winter months, and then they need to, the power company comes in and shuts the power off. Overcrowding situations, again, fall into a larger category of doubled up. And then running out of heat is another substandard housing example that we see over the winter months across the state. Here's the definition, and these slides will be available for folks, but this is just something to note. The one thing that wasn't in there was just abandoned in hospitals. That's certainly something, if you had a case like that in your school community, please reach out to myself and we can work on that situation together with some cross-agency collaboration. And doubled up, like I said, that's the most common situation that families are identified under. And really what we think about for doubled up is, does that family have a legal right to be in the nighttime residence that they're in? And could they be asked to leave with no legal recourse? So sometimes families just move in with another family while they're seeking housing, and they really don't have a legal right to be there, and come some sort of conflict that comes up, they're out of that place. So it's just something to be mindful of. It's always a case, eligibility is always determined on a case-by-case basis by the liaison and their designees and the community that knows, based on the information that the staff that are most familiar with the students have. But this is the most common situation that students are identified for McKinney-Vento under in schools in Maine and across the country. When we talk about McKinney-Vento and when I provide trainings about McKinney-Vento, you hear me say McKinney-Vento, McKinney-Vento, and there's been a historic branding of this being essentially like the homeless program, homeless eligibility in schools. And we've done a lot of that reframing of just this is McKinney-Vento, these students are McKinney-Vento, and trying to shift away from the word homeless and using that a lot because so many of the families that really are eligible for McKinney-Vento, one, are not going to self-identify as experiencing homelessness. They might, in those doubled up situations, have a roof over their head, for example. And the stigma around the word. So just visualizing what comes to mind when hearing the word homeless, and also just reflecting on all of our own vulnerabilities to experiencing homelessness and really thinking about our own vulnerabilities to experiencing even things such as a natural disaster or the traumatic incident of having your home burned down or something like that. And in thinking about if something traumatic like that were to happen, and if you had children, for example, in your local school system, considering where that next place of residence would be that you would go. And are you someone that might have, for example, a sibling a few towns over or a parent a few towns over, and you were able to move in with them temporarily while you navigated what your new permanent housing was going to look like? And if you had those children, your children in your local school system, and you move a couple of towns over, one of the things that McKinney-Vento really provides during that instability is school stability and the opportunity for your children to continue to attend the school of origin, even when there's a tremendous amount of instability outside of school. So it's really about, at its core, keeping kids connected to their supports, keeping children connected to stability in their education and connection to peers and staff. So just something that we've been working on, and noting that Maine is 9th in the nation for rates of homelessness by population. So this is happening in our communities, and a lot of our national research that is done on homelessness really reflects that rural and urban homelessness occurs at similar rates. It just can look quite different. So this is happening in our communities across the state. So we're really just working on picking up identification and making sure that families are aware that schools can be a place for support, and that work of changing the narrative that McKinney-Vento is a resource for everyone in a community in a time of need. In terms of what schools can offer for students, so students are eligible for free meals and that transportation to school of origin. And often McKinney-Vento is that transportation is such a big piece that people hold on to. And it's a really important piece because it's about school stability. So if it's in the best, so if there's a loss of housing that puts a student outside of the catchment area of that SAU, that McKinney-Vento liaison and that new liaison that the town that they're residing in currently would work together to have what we would call a best interest determination. And we default to keeping students in the school of origin for school stability purposes, unless there's an explicit reason to transition them to the new SAU of residence. And then those school communities would work together on that transportation to the school of origin and ensuring that that student could have school stability while there's instability occurring in their housing outside of school. We also see immediate enrollment without required documents. So this is a really important thing. So sometimes students have a loss of housing that puts them way outside of the SAU's catchment area, and it would be unreasonable and not in the best interest of the student to transport them. They move from Bangor to Portland or something like that, because that's where the nearest shelter opening is. Those students have the ability to immediately enroll in school. So once they present and fill out most schools have enrollment paperwork that has a housing questionnaire within it that will flag that they would be McKinney-Vento eligible. And so we get those students through the door. And then the McKinney-Vento liaison and the staff supporting that student would work on getting all of those required documents. Often we get questions of, oh, are they exempt from getting these documents? No, but we get them through the door, we get them connected to the school, and then we work on getting all of those documents and supporting the family in that way. Often comes up with things like vaccinations. McKinney-Vento students aren't exempt from vaccinations. It's just that the liaison is going to work with the family to either get those documents that they have from a provider or work on getting them referred out to a medical provider to get those vaccinations up to date. School supplies, clothing, hygiene items, access to showers and laundry. For older students that are looking at post-secondary options, support with FAFSA. We'll talk briefly about unaccompanied homeless youth and what that means. And then often our liaisons and schools are also working on those referrals out to other agencies that maybe a family might need more case management or specific housing support to navigate the housing system, voucher system, whatever they're working through, as well as healthcare referrals as well. Tutoring and instructional support. We see fees covered for accessing records, or for example, a student that might not have the financial resources to purchase cap and gown or something like that. Really thinking about anything that could present as a significant barrier to accessing education and fully participating in school activities. So that's really what's named in McKinney-Vento, is about those removing barriers to fully participating in school and engaging fully in school activities. So those are the big pieces, and those referral liaisons are making referrals. So if they had a student that was in their school system and there might be a younger kiddo that's not yet school aged involved and not involved in any programming, the liaison might be working on making some of those early childhood referrals out to other agencies as well. And one of the pieces that's in this federal statute that I appreciate is that it addresses that there's going to be unique needs that come up. So there's that other extraordinary or emergency assistance needed. And I have shared in the past a story of when we're looking through our invoices that schools submit for McKinney-Vento funding. We had a case where there was a few children's bathing suits and flip-flops, that had been purchased with their McKinney-Vento dollars. We asked them follow-up questions just to clarify, what's going on? Can you clarify why you made these purchases? And really what it had come down to is that they had a few families that were staying at a family shelter that had congregated showers, and the children didn't have access to bathing suits or anything like that made them feel comfortable taking a shower in a shared space. And so the school was able to make those purchases so that they were able to shower prior to school rather than having them have to access the showers at school and create another barrier to accessing education. So just thinking about the creative problem solving that sometimes schools go into and meeting some of those basic needs so that students can show up to school. Does anyone, I know I'm talking a lot, so I just want to pause for a second. So if anyone has any questions, and always feel free to hop off mute and interrupt me, and I can pause and address anything in the moment. So time frame for McKinney-Vento students. So once they are deemed eligible by the liaison or their designee at the SAU, they're eligible for McKinney-Vento supports for the entire academic year. And so really we think about that as June 30th of each school year, and then July 1 forward, that's where our McKinney-Vento liaisons and their team are working on reaching out to McKinney-Vento students and determining eligibility for the following year. There's no time limit on a student being eligible for McKinney-Vento, and I will share that sometimes we have certain students that just their families have a lot of instability in their life, and they might be McKinney-Vento eligible year after year just because there's a lot of that housing instability occurring. It's not you received McKinney-Vento supports for 3 years and now you're done. It's not like that at all. It's really just about the nighttime residents and if they were eligible for that school year at some point. Really where this can play out is, if a student experiences a loss of housing, say a family is evicted from their apartment in November, they become doubled up with their aunt for in a town over for a few months, and then in April they're able to secure their own apartment again, but that apartment is outside of the SAU of origin where they were attending school. Those students would be able to, if it was in their best interest, finish the school year in the school that they had started and continue that. And then the expectation would be, you're not McKinney-Vento eligible that following school year because permanent housing has been secured. And that's really where they look at enrolling and starting the school year new at that new SAU of residence. Here's just a little bit of why we talk about school stability and really just minimizing some of those educational gaps of why keeping students in the school of origin is a priority under McKinney-Vento and for liaisons. Funding for McKinney-Vento, just a brief overview. So really what this looks like is there's federal dollars. And so there is within Title I, Part A, there needs to be a set-aside, a homeless set-aside for McKinney-Vento students at all schools. So there's also the McKinney-Vento subgrant. So there are McKinney-Vento federal dollars that go out to every state. Maine receives very, very limited McKinney-Vento federal dedicated dollars. And the limited funds that we do have available go out in a request for application. So right now it's a 3-year cycle. So we have 8 SAUs that receive unique McKinney-Vento dollars. And then at the state level, we have the Preventing Student Homelessness Program. And this might be one that people may have heard of. This is quite flexible funding, and it is a pilot program that we've overseen over the past couple of years, and even more flexible than McKinney-Vento dollars. The state legislature has allowable uses of essentially rental assistance, short-term hotel motel stays, utility expenses, critical home repairs, and then anything that is authorized under the McKinney-Vento statute, with emergency financial assistance available up to $750 per student from each fiscal year allocation. We had 1.5 million for FY24, 1.5 million for FY25, and then that was our pilot program phase. And then in the most recent legislative session, the program actually was made into a permanent program, continuing on. But we did see through the appropriations process a significant reduction in funding. So we've got a lot of questions at the DOE level of just, will this funding change? Really is up to the legislature, but it was made into a permanent program. SAUs had the option to receive it, and then really the flexibility to make their budget, build out their budget based on the needs of their community and a local control decision between the allowable uses of, rental assistance, critical home repairs, utilities, and other McKinney-Vento allowable uses. So certainly something to be aware of is that is a unique state fund that we have available, providing some supplementary funding for this work in our school communities. Just defining, here's some statutory pieces from the federal language. And school of origin really is the school that a child or youth attended when permanently housed, or the school in which the child or youth was last enrolled, including a preschool. So that preschool addition was really part of ESSA, and preschool, thinking about preschools that are implemented by the SAU. So if the SAU is implementing a preschool program, and there is a student that meets the definition of McKinney-Vento, the school would be responsible for the provision of McKinney-Vento services for that preschool student. School of residence is the school where the student is residing at night and is involved in really that best interest determination for the student, where the student might immediately enroll if it was in their best interest. And just thinking about enrollment is defined as attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So we really try and get those students immediately through the doors and attending school. Best interest determinations. Really, this is a student-centered decision looking at all the various services that might be available for a student at the school of residence versus the school of origin, the unique circumstances of each student. And again, this is always case by case, but really it's about bringing as many folks to the table, including those liaisons from the school of origin and the school of residence. And then certainly we see teachers, school staff involved in those discussions that might know the student best as well to help kind of carry out those best interest determinations for more complicated cases where there is some back and forth of what is in the best interest of that student, whether to keep them in the school of origin or the school of residence. And just clarifying that McKinney-Vento really isn't a school choice thing that does come up sometimes. It's really that best interest between the school of residence and the school of origin. Here's just some of those considerations, really the age of the child or youth, and we'll get questions at the DOE level of, well, does it make sense to transport a student an hour, or we don't want to transport a student more than an hour? And an hour is a long time in a van or whatever vehicle is being used to bring that student back to the school of origin. But again, we always go back to that case by case situation. What is the duration, the potential duration that they're going to be in that nighttime residence, and also looking at a decision that might be made for an elementary school student in the fall versus a high school student that is the winter time and they're a senior in high school. The transportation, the distance of transportation and length of time in transportation, and that piece of the bid determination, and bid, I mean best interest determination, might differ for those two different situations, right? So again, that case by case situation. And really, this is a general education decision that might look at some of the special instruction and special education services available, but really this is a general education decision. Here's just the statutory reference related to transportation, but really what it's saying is that the SAU of origin and the SAU of which that student is residing in are responsible for coordinating transportation together. And if they, for example, maybe one SAU might do AM transportation, one SAU might do PM transportation. That's a common thing that we see implemented for McKinney-Vento transportation. Really, there's that coordination between those two SAUs. And if they cannot come to an agreed upon arrangement for transportation, that's where the costs are split 50-50. But really, it's about communication. And we emphasize all the time that schools really should just be, we don't want to see schools getting billed at the end of the school year for a student that they did not know was residing in their school community, because that should have been a discussion that occurred when that student initially moved to that school community. Disputes. So sometimes there may be disputes that occur related to eligibility or the best interest determination. And those are things that the Maine DOE certainly supports on. But really, a student or family needs to be aware that they have the right to dispute an eligibility determination or a best interest determination that was made on their behalf by the school working with them. So if a school were to make a best interest determination for the student, so maybe they say, we actually really think it's in your best interest to enroll in the school of residence, they would need to provide a written notice to the family of why they made a decision that differed from keeping the student in the school of origin like the family wanted. And in that written notice, there needs to be the right to dispute that decision. And we receive disputes at the state level related to that eligibility piece or those best interest determinations. But really, that written notice is a key piece that we reiterate to our liaisons often, making sure that families, and in the case of an unaccompanied homeless youth, they are aware of their right to dispute those decisions. And then here's that piece about written notices and ensuring that all of that is documented for the family. An important piece of McKinney-Vento and demographic that is a student that we get a lot of questions on are our unaccompanied homeless youth. And unaccompanied homeless youth are really students that are in a nighttime residence that is a McKinney-Vento eligible situation. So it's lacking fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And they're in that nighttime residence without being in the physical custody of their legal guardian. So that's the really key piece. They're McKinney-Vento eligible and they're in that nighttime residence without being in the physical custody of their legal guardian. That's how we get an unaccompanied homeless youth. We often are referring to them as our UHY students. There's a lot of different situations that a student might become an unaccompanied homeless youth as a result of, and there's no lower age limit on an unaccompanied homeless youth. So I will say we have unaccompanied homeless youth in the state of Maine that are elementary school students, that are pre-K students. And that might be the result of a family experiencing an eviction, and the children in the home might have the opportunity to stay with grandma or grandpa, aunt or uncle, but there is not enough room in that nighttime residence for the legal guardians to be there. So you might see them have to go to an adult shelter, or they're living in their car, but the children are with another relative for the time being. But they're all sort of collectively experiencing homelessness, but they're in that nighttime residence without being in the physical custody of their legal guardian. The other situations that come up for unaccompanied homeless youth are older students, middle school, high school, where we see family conflict occurring potentially in the home, and that student is either asked to leave the home by the legal guardian or makes the decision to leave the home of the legal guardian and move in with another relative or friends, boyfriend, girlfriend. Really, it's based on the nighttime residence. So if you have a high school student that is staying with boyfriend, is that home that student is staying in a truly fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence? Do they have a legal right to be there? Should they be there, or is that an agreed upon arrangement with the legal guardian? The National Center for Homeless Education has a flow chart. This is the flow chart that often liaisons are using to help make a determination, but it's really just thinking about is that nighttime residence fixed, regular, and adequate, and sort of separating some of the other pieces of the situation and reiterating that McKinney-Vento at its core is about ensuring that students are able to access school and fully participate. So really it's about ensuring that those students can get to school every day, regardless of what's happening outside of school. So sometimes schools will be approached by legal guardians asking of, oh, I can't believe transportation is being provided to my student back to school right now. And just reiterating that really the school has a legal obligation under the statute to make sure that that student can get to school each day and being able to participate in their education. Certainly, schools and liaisons can make referrals to family mediation and all of those other providers that might be able to support the conflict that is occurring outside of the home, but really making sure that that student in the meantime is able to access school while they're going through whatever is happening outside of the classroom. And yep, so the other piece I wanted to share about unaccompanied homeless youth is this is Maine specific statute, and other states have this statute as well or similar statute. A student that is an unaccompanied homeless youth and living separate of parental support is able to give consent to all medical, mental, dental, and other health counseling and services if they're living separately. So that would be documentation that the school is providing. It can also be provided by a homeless youth provider group or an attorney working with a student. But that's just something to note for state-specific statute as it relates to unaccompanied homeless youth. There's also a law that was passed in the most recent legislative session that allows emancipated minors as well as our unaccompanied homeless youth to access their vital records at no cost with that documentation of their unaccompanied homeless youth status from the school. So we've heard feedback that this has been working, that schools have been able to access vital records with that documentation. And it is significant, the barrier that a state ID or a birth certificate costs, even though those costs can be minimal, $5, $15, just determining where that funding is going to come from can be a barrier. So having this statute in place has been already quite helpful for our liaisons and providers. Specific to special education, unaccompanied homeless youth, that there are some students that are unaccompanied homeless youth that have relationships with their guardians, and the school communicates with the guardians, and everything runs smoothly. And this is not a special education surrogate parent would not be an appropriate person for that student. It is a special education surrogate parent is, our McKinney-Vento students, and then we have our unaccompanied homeless youth, and then those unaccompanied homeless youth that have an IEP and do not have either the school does not have a communication with the legal guardian. Those are students that need to have a special education surrogate parent appointed. And Sarah Ferguson from the Office of Special Services is the point of contact for helping get that person appointed into that role. But that is just something to note, that unaccompanied homeless youth, they can't consent to their own special education services. And if there's not a guardian that is able to do that, then a special education surrogate parent will need to be appointed for that student. And Sarah Ferguson at OSSE would be the person to reach out to. And please know, I know I've mentioned foster care a couple of times. All foster care youth really need to have a special education surrogate parent assigned as well, because that caseworker cannot sign off on that student's IEP. So that is just something to note as well. Any questions about that? I'm talking at you, so I want to give you some opportunities. All right. So McKinney-Vento, here's just some data for our state. So you'll see that we've really had a substantial rise in our identification of McKinney-Vento students in the state of Maine. And that rise is really after our first pandemic school year. And we get a lot of questions of, oh, there's been such an increase in homelessness. There's been news stories about it. And absolutely, we have seen an increase in families and students experiencing homelessness. There's rising cost of living. Housing is really hard to come by in the state, affordable housing particularly. Also, this rise corresponds with an increase of funding that we saw through the American Rescue Plan that had dedicated homeless children and youth dollars. That was unprecedented amount of money that went specifically to supporting McKinney-Vento programming in schools. So it gave us at the state level the opportunity to do a tremendous amount of outreach and public service announcements and working on trainings and building capacity for schools to identify and support students. And our SAUs received dollars to be able to implement programming, hire staff, build out different resource centers and things like that were for these students. So there is just those two things that are happening at the same time when we've seen this really dramatic rise in identification of students through our school system. And this is from the 23-24 school year, but this is pretty consistent. We always see that doubled up being the most common situation, and just specifically naming that these 4 categories here are the 4 categories that are required for us when schools are inputting information into their student information system about a McKinney-Vento student. It asks them Was a student doubled up, shelter, hotel, motel, unsheltered? So we talked about all those different situations that a student might be in. These are just the four reportable categories. So unsheltered, for example, is where we see substandard housing. That's where students are identified under. But doubled up, again, most common situation. These are our McKinney-Vento students and some of the unique characteristics that they might have. So you'll see that we've seen a lot of a rise in multilingual students that are McKinney-Vento. You'll see that really quite consistent. Around 15% of our McKinney-Vento total students are unaccompanied homeless youth as well within that identification. And then a lot of our McKinney-Vento students are also receiving special education services through their SAU. So really my key takeaways from our conversation and training here today is just being aware that if you are working with a student that may be eligible, please connect them and build that relationship with your liaison. Know who your liaison is at the local level and how to get in contact. Be familiar with your local policies and procedures for identification and potential services that are available. And really just being able to have information available, even if you have a poster in your office or your classroom space. And being mindful of using the word homeless too, of just that shifting of language that we've done of just talking about McKinney-Vento eligibility and that reframe of language to build trust with our families and students, and really asking those questions for clarity of potential eligibility, not curiosity, and being mindful of that relationship building with families in that dialogue. Next steps, we have a great McKinney-Vento website that has a lot of sample forms. There's a lot of information on it. We've been building it out and changing it along the way, but if you are working with students, working with other SAUs, please, bookmark that McKinney-Vento liaison lookup page, but you can always visit that McKinney-Vento website. We also have our own McKinney-Vento and foster care office hours that occur on the first Thursday of every month at 3 p.m. And we typically, similar to these office hours, like to offer some professional development opportunities. So we'll have folks from the Office of Special Services come and talk about specific things, or restorative practices, or early childhood, or higher ed, all of those pieces. So if that's something you're interested in getting involved in, please sign up with the link here. And then we also have a monthly newsletter that goes out for McKinney-Vento and foster care that talks about resources, FAQs, and things like that. But if there are no the other thing I wanted to say is that two great resources to be aware of, and really shout out to Schoolhouse Connection. That is the national nonprofit advocacy group that does a tremendous amount of trainings and provides a lot of educational materials for liaisons about McKinney-Vento. So they are a great resource. They have awesome newsletters that go out, awesome trainings. It's really great working with them. And then National Network for Youth is another national agency that does work for students experiencing homelessness, young people experiencing homelessness. So just being aware that there are a couple of those other national players that support this work as well. I appreciate you taking some time with me today to go over all of this. I know I talked for a while there, but if there's any questions, and if you have any questions that come up after, or you're working with a student or have some clarifying questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. This is my email address and phone number. You can reach out to anyone at the DOE, and I'm sure they can get you in contact with me as well. But if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think.
Actually, Signe, if you could keep sharing, I think we have a few resources that we share typically at the end.
Oh, yes.
While you're pulling that back up, we do have our feedback link. So I just dropped that in the chat. Hopefully that that looks weird to me right now, but I don't know what's happening with it, but hopefully it works. If it doesn't, please let me know. So we just have resources. We'll kind of fly through these. They're the typical ones. If you come to our office hours, this is our link to where you can find all the special ed law stuff. The next one is to our support page. So this is where you can find us, supervision, monitoring, and support. And then our next slide is about our resources. So if you click from our main page to resources, it'll bring you here. But you can also bookmark this resources page. This is where you can get all the information that we put out to people. And then we also have our professional learning that's available. So whenever we do office hours or any trainings that are out to the public, we do record them and put them up here. So you can reference them at any time. And then we have our PD schedule. We've done many so far, and then we have some more coming up. So please join us. The registration links are for the ones that are upcoming because we do go until the end of May. So you can access those as well. Yep, these are the ones that are coming up. So those are those. Oh, and then this last one, I think we went over all these except for that last one that is kind of cut off, the resources for families and schools forms. So if you're ever looking for any of those forms that you need, special ed forms, that's where you can go to find those. And then I think it's our feedback form. There we go. And I put that link and Ashley says it does work. So thank you for checking that. So we appreciate the feedback. So if you could just answer the few questions that we put out there, that would be great. And then you'll select today's training. And it is today's date, 2/11/26, and it will say McKinney-Vento 101. Just select that, put your email, and I'll send you a contact hour for joining us today. Then I'm pretty sure it's Maine DOE where you can find us online, social media, all that good stuff. Check us out. And then last but not least is our contact information. So if you ever want to reach out to us, you can. It was on our introduction page as well with our emails. So feel free to reach out. And that's it. So I hope you have a great evening and we'll see you all next time.